The forests of eastern Australia host many creatures of wonder and intrigue, yet all too often this fair realm holds them unto itself as subtle secrets fiercely withheld from our prying eyes, and few but the most keen, attentive, or perhaps simply fortunate of observers stand a chance to pierce this veil, beneath which a world of ceaseless discovery, fascination, and adventure awaits. My name is Jackson, and for many years I have devoted a concerning and possibly unhealthy portion of my waking hours to uncovering some of this country's most fascinating inhabitants. In that time I've gotten up close and personal with such icons as the redback spider, and of course the notorious funnel webs. But for me, there has always been greater allure in the obscure than the infamous, and back when I was a child, one particular animal kindled a level of interest and at times obsession that persisted undampened for years to come, and that to this day, nothing else I have encountered has managed to surpass. It's a creature that, in certain respects, seems almost garishly out of place in its habitat, something that would look more at home in a rock pool or a reef than a forest. Triboniophorus graeffei, the red triangle slug. Growing to around 15 centimeters in length, Triboniophorus graeffei is one of the largest land-living slugs in the country. It occurs along much of Australia's eastern coast, inhabiting not only pristine forests, but suburban parks and gardens as well. And for me, this strange mollusk was the catalyst of years' worth of exploration, and eventually a couple encounters so unexpected and surreal that they bordered on comical. I have long had a tendency to hyperfixate on certain interests, and from the moment I first stumbled upon photographs of these remarkable slugs in a field guide to local wildlife over 10 years ago, I was completely hooked, and in my mind there now burned a fierce resolve to track down the red triangle slug for myself, and behold all its weirdness and wonder in the flesh. For a sizable chunk of my childhood, many a weekend would be spent combing the local bushlands on the hunt for Triboniophorus, and initially things were looking quite promising, for telltale signs of these slugs' activity were everywhere. These squiggly markings are the slugs' feeding tracks, which they leave behind after scraping algae, mold, and lichens off a surface, usually the trunks of eucalypt trees. And once I learned to recognize them, I would be hard-pressed to go just about anywhere without them crossing my sight. From wild lands where not whisper nor rumour of humanity existed save for the path beneath my feet, to public parks, bustling and lively in the very midst of suburbia, the red triangle slug's distinctive signature was everywhere to be seen, and surely, with the slugs so clearly abundant, I was bound to find one sooner rather than later. But it wasn't long before I was disabused of those expectations. Weeks faded into months, months faded into years, as forays beyond count, each as fruitless as the last, piled up, and the regular sighting of the slug's feeding tracks, which for a time had me hopeful and convinced I was hot on the heels of my target, soon seemed to be more of a taunt than anything else. For while their tracks were a nigh inescapable sight, Triboniophorus itself almost ceased to feel like a real animal. More of a cryptid it was, its very existence entirely confined to the pages of the books I would so fervently peruse. And it wasn't until I had eventually abandoned my weekend hobby of slug hunting, or in simpler terms, finally got a fucking life, that I eventually crossed paths with one of these remarkable animals. The first individual I happened upon was sheltering under a small, rusty tin that I had absent-mindedly kicked over moments before, and the second, in what I still consider to be one of my most ludicrously unexpected animal encounters ever, I put my hand on in the dark while playing hide-and-seek on a school camp. Thankfully the slug was completely unharmed. In the years between then and now, I have had a handful of additional run-ins with Triboniophorus, but I knew, just from the prevalence of their feeding tracks alone, that these slugs were far more common than my sparse encounters would suggest, and recently my childhood slug fever has returned with a vengeance. And now, several years later, I'm back on the hunt. Searching for the hidden gems of the wilderness is almost always a matter of being in the right place at the right time. And while it was evident that I had been scouring all the right places, that alone was clearly not enough. To stand a good chance of encountering Triboniophorus, good timing would be essential. In the bitter watches of the night, when storm clouds, dark and ominous, finally burst asunder, and a deluge of pure, fresh water descends from heights unseen, and all manner of life forms that otherwise exist in naught but rumour spring into activity. The shy, the cryptic, the wondrous and the weird all shed their secrecy to make the most of these cool, dark and damp conditions. For Triboniophorus, it's the perfect chance for them to explore, feed and search for a mate, until dawn arrives and the fierce rays of the Australian sun force them back into their subterranean slumber. But if the rainy, overcast weather persists into the day, the slugs may be afforded ample protection from the sun to continue their foraging for a few extra hours, and I may, if I arrive early enough in the morning, be able to catch them out and about. And while I did suspect that timing my forays with the slugs' expected periods of activity would make them easier to find, just how much easier would come as a bit of a shock. So I came here under the assumption that the hunt for the red triangle slug would be a bit of a journey, a bit of an adventure, where I'd be able to explore the area and take you with me every step of the way. Well, I've been exploring for the better part of 2 minutes. I can still see my car in the parking lot behind me, and I've already found one. It's on this tree right behind me. This anonymous-looking blob is what I had come for. A very large Triboniophorus graeffei. So that was mission accomplished then and there, and within minutes of arrival to boot. But I think it's safe to say that none of you are here to see some blurry footage of a barely discernible grey blob halfway up a tree. So the hunt continued, and it wasn't long before I found a second individual in a much more workable location. So after a little bit more searching, I have finally found one that's in a much more optimal position for filming. Take a look at this. Now you might even be able to see the slug's feeding tracks all around it. If you look at these patches here where the trunk of the tree appears smoother and cleaner, that is where the slug has scraped off the algae coating and consumed it. And this individual is quite a fair size. It's about the length of my pointer finger. But trust me when I say that they get a lot bigger than this. So let's see if we can find a full-sized adult. A few minutes later I came upon another slug, slightly larger than the last, yet still far from fully grown. And it wasn't until the end of this short venture that I encountered one of respectable size. And in keeping with their tendency to show up in the most unexpected of places, this one was serendipitously found hiding beneath a corrugated roof right after I decided to wrap things up for the day. So the deluge is starting to close in once again. I'm just about to wrap up filming, and look what I find. It's dropping a bit of waste on my hands. Very, very classy there, sir. But finally, we have found a fair-sized red triangle slug. Even so, they still get considerably bigger than this. A couple of the ones that I saw high up trees out of reach would have been nearly twice the mass of this one, I'd estimate. But it's quite an impressive looking slug nonetheless, and of course there is a plane. But plane or no plane, I am going to have to keep this segment brief. The weather is not getting any better, and I think it's about time that we let this incredible little slug go on its merry way. Again and again I returned to this same place on cool, wet mornings after a night of heavy rain. Sometimes for a nice, easy walk, and other times for a run, because running is basically my whole personality. And on every trip, the slugs, which had hitherto eluded me for years, would be found within minutes of arrival. On one outing, I located more than 10 in the space of an hour. Finally, it seemed their spell of secrecy had been lifted, and Triboniophorus graeffei, once so elusive that its very existence felt as dubious as a run that wasn't posted to Strava, was now as real as it gets. Triboniophorus graeffei belongs to a family known as the Aethorhacophoridea, and while Triboniophorus occurs exclusively in Australia, the Aethorhacophorids as a whole have a somewhat broader range, existing in New Zealand as well as a number of smaller islands. Many, including Triboniophorus itself, possess a faint but noticeable texture on their upper surface resembling the veins of a leaf, and the group is thus commonly referred to as the leaf-veined slugs. But the group's proper name, Aethorhacophoridae, stems from a different feature. The prefix "a" means without, and the rest of the name comes from the Greek word thoracophoros, meaning breastplate, so the family's name as a whole translates to mean without breastplate, and this refers to the greatly reduced mantle possessed by all members of the group. While many slugs have a large and very distinctive mantle, a feature that can be said to resemble a saddle or, of course, a breastplate, in Aethorhacophorids the mantle is far less pronounced, comprising nothing more than a small triangular patch, which in many Aethorhacophorids is almost indistinguishable from the rest of the slug's body, though, of course, in Triboniophorus graeffei, the mantle's red, or on occasion orange, outline makes it a lot more boldly defined, creating the animal's namesake red triangle. At the centre of the mantle resides a very curious feature. This wet, sticky, pulsating hole, okay, keep it in your pants, mate, is what's known as a pneumostome, which land-living slugs and snails use to breathe. And at the very front of the animal is a pair of retractable tentacles upon which the slug's eyes are borne. Triboniophorus, like all Aethorhacophorids, possesses only a single pair of tentacles, which sets it apart from most other types of slug, many of which, like this Levicalis, an introduced species that originated in Africa, have an additional smaller pair of sensory tentacles beneath the upper pair. On the underside of the head is the slug's mouth, within which is set a tongue-like structure covered in minute teeth. This, known as a radula, is what the slug uses to scrape off the biofilm of algae and mold upon which it feeds, leaving behind its signature tracks. A closer look at the slug's feeding trails will reveal that they are comprised of numerous semicircular markings, each of which represents an individual motion of the radula. These tracks often occur in a wavy or even zigzagging pattern, a result of the slug moving its head from side to side as it grazes. Across its rather broad range, Triboniophorus graeffei exhibits quite a stunning degree of variation in colour. These off-white forms local to Brisbane are perhaps the most familiar, but other populations of these slugs can differ quite dramatically. Some are bright pink, bearing a striking resemblance to a fillet of raw fish. Others can be a vibrant shade of orange or yellow. Further south, around Sydney, these slugs often possess a bold red line running the length of their body in addition to the usual red triangle. But regardless of how they look as adults, juvenile Triboniophorus graeffei all exhibit the same appearance, being pale and somewhat translucent, lacking a red triangle and instead possessing a series of dark longitudinal stripes, which steadily fade out as the animal grows. With such a conspicuous appearance, combined with foraging habits that leave them exposed for long periods of time, and of course the fact that slugs aren't exactly known for their speed, Triboniophorus would seem exceedingly vulnerable to attack. But even though these slugs possess no obvious weapons, they are not without defense. We all know that slugs are slimy. It's kinda their thing. But Triboniophorus has taken this seemingly innocuous feature to another level. It has turned itself into a living glue trap, and the effectiveness of this defense was witnessed firsthand by scientists out in the field. On a nighttime foray, a large tree frog was found in the oddest of predicaments, seemingly glued to a branch and unable to move. But there was no need to look very far to identify a possible culprit, for a Triboniophorus sat mere centimeters away. The adhered amphibian was observed over the following 24 hours, during which it was unable to free itself despite repeated struggles. Meanwhile, the properties of the slug's slimy coatings were investigated under laboratory conditions. Under normal circumstances, the mucus coating produced by the slugs did not appear to be especially noteworthy, but a slight physical disturbance was enough to elicit a different reaction. A simple prod of the animal's body often led to a contraction of the immediate area and the rapid secretion of copious amounts of an exceedingly adhesive mucus. Thus it became clear beyond doubt that Triboniophorus was indeed the agent of the unfortunate frog's sticky situation. The usage of slime as a defense has been recorded in other slugs aside from Triboniophorus, but in these cases it merely serves as a deterrent, meant to make the slug unpalatable to a potential predator. Triboniophorus, however, has turned it into a much more devious and potent device, something that not only repels predators, but can outright incapacitate them for hours or even days on end, leaving the would-be attacker at risk of death by starvation, predation, or perhaps just sheer embarrassment from picking a fight with a slug and coming out second best. Sharing the weirdness and wonder of the red triangle slug with the world is, to me, an incredibly satisfying way to cap off a childhood spent endlessly in futile pursuit of this very same animal. And being able to now find them in large numbers with absolute ease is testament to just how much difference taking a more methodical approach to wildlife observation can make. And yet, this story ends in a way that uncannily echoes the first couple times I ever beheld Triboniophorus in the flesh, stumbling across one in the most ridiculous of circumstances and guided by naught but blind, dumb luck. On one of those days when I wasn't quite feeling like a run, but was nevertheless compelled to get off my bony ass for a few hours, I went for a little stroll around the suburbs. Oftentimes on my walks I like to brainstorm ideas for videos, and at the time I was mentally drafting the script of this very upload that you're watching right now. And as I approached a bus stop right by a busy main road, a most familiar sight materialized as though it had been conjured by the very thoughts that were running through my head. There, right above me, was a red triangle slug, and one of the largest I had ever seen up close. I wasn't overly keen on leaving it out in the open in such a busy area, especially with the sun's heat getting ever more intense, so I decided to move it somewhere a little safer, carrying it upon my hand as I searched for a place more natural and secluded. After a few more minutes of walking, I arrived at what looked to be an ideal spot to bid my slippery little friend a fond farewell, and set it upon the trunk of a tree to continue on its merry way. But if randomly coming across an animal in an odd spot while already thinking about that exact animal wasn't coincidence enough, I soon noticed something else. Beneath a loose sheet of bark on the same tree, only a few centimeters away from the slug I had just released, was another Triboniophorus, this one with more orange markings instead of the typical red. Truly it seems that even after I had familiarized myself with these slugs' daily routines and made them appear a much more predictable target, Triboniophorus graeffei remains ever so eager to remind me of its proclivity for showing up when I least expect it. And even now, with the slug's veil of secrecy cast aside, and with it the allure of the mysterious and the unknown, Triboniophorus graeffei, the red triangle slug, remains to me a source of boundless fascination, sparking just as much wonder in my deadpan adult self as it did in my childhood when first I laid eyes upon its otherworldly visage. If you're interested in learning about other strange, cryptic entities that, like Triboniophorus, are roused by the rains, then feel free to check out this video showcasing some of the incredible fungi that can be found across southeast Queensland. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, then you are warmly welcome to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on my next adventure.